I'm going to read from this passage, verse 5 and verse 11. And I want you to see the difference between verse 5 and verse 11. I want you to see the difference between the law and grace. Thus saith the Lord. Here beginneth the reading of God's holy word. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. We can't get much of a difference than that, can we? You may take your seats. I have entitled tonight's message, Her, a Season of Harvest. Because if you look back on your life, and if I look back on my life, there was a time that I was out there where something was planted within me where I'm here tonight. There was harvesting that took place in my life. Jesus found that, one day right here, down here, that Jennifer was ready to be harvested, and there was such. The seed was planted within me, and thank God that I was obedient enough to go ahead and go with that growth. Because it's easy to say, thank you, Lord, I've been saved, and walk away and just never look back. But you can't, I don't know how anybody can do that if you really understand where you've come from. We have to understand that Christ has brought us a long, long way. And if it weren't for him dying on the cross, we wouldn't have anywhere to go after death. God could wipe us out and we wouldn't even know that we were here. So I just want to thank God for making us, her, a season of harvest, him a season of harvest, and just having that harvest season, period. So tonight, I'm going to start this, and I must say to this, before I start, Pastor, I guess you had the meal. This is a dessert. A smaller version, but just as sweet. All right. So here we start. Job 28:24 says, For he looketh to the ends of the earth, and seeth under the whole heaven. So if you ever think that you're going to pull a fast one on God, back it up a little bit. He sees everything from the grand to the minute. He sees what's in our heart. He sees what we see on the outside. He sees, more importantly, what's on our inside. God knows everything there is to know about us. We may look cute in church and everything's okay, but still thinking about that person that really irritated me yesterday. Not knowing that they're taking away the praise and worship that should go to God. We have to be careful. He knows everything. So tonight, we're going to go through a story of actually sin and the consequence of an agenda. Sin was the woman, the agenda was someone else. So we're going to go and we're going to talk about this woman and also a story of a foiled sting operation. For those who like a little sting operation, this is what it means. A sting operation is a deceptive operation designed to catch a person committing a crime. And this is law enforcement. So we're going to look at this at the following 3 points. Point number 1, law. Point number 2, grace. Point number 3, forgiveness. I'm going to read verses 2 to 5, and then if you want to play the game, you really have to know who the players are, don't you? We're going to get to know who the players are in this game. Verse 2 to 5, And early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery, in the very act. They saw it. Somebody saw it. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? Okay, let's get the background straight. This is taking place during Sukkot, which is a Hebrew holiday. It's a harvest, the first harvest. It's during Yom Kippur, which is a Jewish New Year. 4 days after that, this is when it takes place. So it's taking place about now, actually. This is it's called Tisseree, but it's at the end of September, beginning of October. It's also known as the Feast of the Tabernacle and the Booths. Now, they have the Feast of the Tabernacles, which is the Feast of Tents, where they celebrated that God actually had them in tents after he pulled them out of slavery. The same how people were celebrating that they have shelter after a storm. So they should be celebrating some feasts of the, some booths and tabernacles and harvests of what they can get. Here are the players. The scribes and the Pharisees. Boy, what a bunch. The scribes, now this is how we describe them. The original occupation of the scribe was to make copies of official documents in the age before printing. The New Testament scribes are a special group among the Jewish religious leaders. Their primary duty were to study the law of Moses, that was their primary duty, teach it to the people, and even help settle disputes involving questions of the law. Interesting. The Pharisee, a favorite with Jesus, not. A member of an ancient Jewish sect, distinguished by strict observances of traditional and written law, and commonly held to pretensions to superior sanctity. A snob. They got so caught up in themselves, they couldn't even tell themselves apart because of their sanctity. A self-righteous person, a hypocrite. Now, they clashed with Jesus over Jesus' interpretation of the law. He called them out. Jesus threatened their security, prestige, and income. Matthew 23, 25, and 27 of the NIV says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites." He just called them what they were. You clean the outside of your cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. Same thing, he opened up this one the same way. You are like the whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of dead and everything unclean. This is a snapshot, because he has had several things to say about him. In fact, they were really so much into Rome and the politics of it all that they completely forgot what their roles were. As we continue, here is this woman. We don't know who she was. We don't have a name. We don't have where she was from. None of that stuff. We do know that she was humiliated, embarrassed, in a state of bewilderment probably, anxious because she was caught in the act of sex with somebody she shouldn't have been there with in the first place. And who knows, maybe she was looking for the person that she was in the act with. She was caught by herself and brought into the temple where Jesus was teaching in front of all the crowd. Now we have to remember this was a major, major, major celebration. There were thousands of people. Jesus was teaching all week. And this particular morning, here comes this woman brought in by the scribes and the Pharisees because they wanted to get Jesus. They had their agenda. Now, if you can indulge me in agendas just for a minute, the original scene of the crime, Genesis 3, in the garden, God, Satan, Eve, Adam. Satan had his agenda, the fall of man. He told Eve, you go, girl, we can eat from that tree. Ain't nothing gonna happen to you. God, he promised you one thing, don't worry, go ahead, do it. She went ahead and did it. We've been paying for it ever since. That's that agenda. We had another agenda a couple years ago in Bermuda. Anybody remember 2 words and a comma? Anybody remember that? When we had a Pharisee spirit up in the House of Assembly by a lawyer, a keeper of the law, who wanted to go ahead and amend the Human Rights Act to include sexual orientation, knowing full well that it was going straight to same-sex marriage. He was the same Pharisee-spirited lawyer who defended these two in court. The agenda goes a long, long way. It touches Bermuda, and what a result that we've had since. The Pharisee spirit. And we can recognize that because it will show its face. It can look all robed and everything else that it wants. It will show its face. So back to this woman. Now, funny thing is, the scribes and the Pharisees brought this woman and they're asking Jesus, okay, You're going to stone her? What should you do? But here's the plot. This is what they wanted. It really wasn't about the woman. It was entrapping Jesus. She sinned. We all know that. Could they have taken care of this privately? Sure, they could have. But they chose to out Jesus. Not this woman. We don't know what, we don't know how, we don't know what. But back then, there was no Facebook, no Twitter. You had to catch somebody in the act. So somebody had to set this woman up somehow. I mean, the thing is, going through this research and Googling how was this woman said, you should see the amount of conspiracy theories of how this woman how she was caught. Some people say she was in with the Scribes and the Pharisees, so they knew exactly who she was with. Some people say that she was caught the night before, kept somewhere, and just whittled out just to embarrass Jesus. The theories go on. I don't know. I wasn't there. I have no clue. But what was happening, this was the test. Now remember, if Jesus agreed to stone this woman, he was going against Roman law. At the time, Rome was the only one to order executions. Remember, that caused confusion during his trial. If Jesus was to do this, the Romans would have considered him a murderer. However, there was stoning going on, and this is supported by the death of Stephen, the follower of Jesus. And you can find this in Acts 7, verse 54, and Acts 8, verse 2. Rome tolerated this. I think what they did was, if it's going to get rid of a Jesus person, I will just turn my head. There will be no investigation. It's just going to be somebody going. But they still were the law, okay? Now, if Jesus did not choose to stone her, he would be going against the law of Moses. However, the scribes and the Pharisees did alter the law. The same people who were writers of the law, scholars, and who started 613 laws, not just the 10, let's put it out there, there's 613. But they didn't have everything. Deuteronomy 22:22 says, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. Both. These are the scholars of 613, okay? Leviticus 20:10, if a man commits adultery with another man's wife, the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Misuse of the law, showing the subtlety of Satan. This is New Testament going back to Genesis 3. But you know what? These self-righteous men were exposed her sin, and Jesus' mercy exposed their hypocrisy. So we're going on to point 2, grace. So that was the law set up to entrap him. Verses 6 to 9. This they said, tempting him, that he might have accused him. But Jesus stooped down with his finger, wrote on the ground as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, he that is without sin, let him cast the first stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. The woman was still standing, and she was quiet. She didn't throw anybody under the bus. She didn't try to defend herself. Sometimes we have to learn to keep our mouth shut and let it roll out, because you will keep yourself out of trouble. We just remember that we don't always have to be the first one out of the gate. Interesting text, how this one turned around. The crowd kept asking Jesus of what he was going to do, tempting him, and they weren't letting up. I'm sure they weren't quiet about it, and the scene was getting very loud and contentious. He did what parents do to children. He tuned them out. He knew what was going on. He knew that this was a test. He knew what these people were all about. He said nothing, wrote on the sand, and I'm sure the crowd was ready to stone him. Something when you know your enemy. However, and we're getting into my favorite part, We are all sinners. These people who were so hell-bent on killing her for her sin was asked a question that they find most uncomfortable. Well, what about you? Some people have no problem killing or accusing others. However, when the question is asked of us, can we really look honestly into ourselves and objectively about our own sin? This woman's sin was a given. Everybody knew it. How about those secret sins that were done and no one knows about them? Could Jesus have written in the sand about those who were ready to stone her? Could he have known some? Could he have written, Jennifer, liar. Jennifer, murderer. He could have written adultery. He could have written lust. He could have written anything that was against him. Because guess what? We're being recorded right now in heaven. We need to make sure that we have it right. No problem on aiming those stones at someone else, because that aim is pretty sharp when you're aiming at someone else. You wouldn't miss them for a world, but how would you feel about somebody aiming a stone at you? I don't know if you will really appreciate the fact that, you know what? It's not about how we do, it's all about how you're redeemed. Hearts were being searched and convicted from the eldest to the youngest. Jesus took care of the crowd first, and then he took care of her. She was still standing quietly in her sin. The Lord didn't change, you know, as these people dropped their stones and walked away. The Lord didn't change. Instead, grace ushered in. Grace trumped the law. She stood in Jesus' restoration and not in the accuser's condemnation. James 2:10 says, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point is guilty of all." Aren't you glad you've been redeemed? Aren't you glad for that blood that was shed for you? Aren't you glad that you can get up and just walk up on the pulpit and have no problem because your hands and your heart are clean? You know, it's not easy for some people to walk through that door and look like they go to church, but on the inside they just sin so much and sit and are convicted, but will not come up to this altar. May God help them. So point 3, forgiveness. 10 and 11. When Jesus had lifted up himself, he saw none but the woman. He said unto her, "Woman, where are thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee?" She said, "No man, Lord." And Jesus said unto her, "Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more." She remained quiet. And I do believe that she was emptying herself out to receive the redemption of the Holy Spirit right in front of her face. She didn't have to worry about depending on a Holy Spirit that we cannot see. She saw Jesus. How can anybody stand in the presence of Jesus and not empty themselves out, honestly, to expect the redemption? Jesus gave it to her. She stood there in her shame and ended up being in glory. I don't know if she had on a robe. I don't know if she had on a sheet. But she was covered in glory. I don't know if she was someone who went when Jesus was crucified and said, "That was the man right there who's hanging up there who saved me." She could have been, because in the same chapter, it goes on about how he was crucified. And I wondered when I was doing this, Lord, did she go to his crucifixion? Was she a walking testimony of how wonderful, how he saved her out of her sin? I mean, I really wonder, because we never hear about her again. We don't. Now, let's not get it twisted. Jesus didn't condone her sin. He told her to go and sin no more. He set a standard. The standard was set. Now, remember, Sukkot was the celebration of harvest. And what a harvest. Now, when I was doing this, it was a Sunday morning. I was coming to church. And I talked to the Lord like I talked to my sister. I said, "Lord, look, who is this dude? Like, who is this guy?" And this is what he said to me, and it really bothered me. He says, "Jennifer, consider the woman the church, and consider the man's sin. Do you see what's going around you? I said, okay, Lord. The church is committing spiritual adultery. This afternoon, I was going through my notes, and the Lord brought 4 examples. They're quick. The first one, I was a spiritual infant. I had just rededicated my life. It was after 5 o'clock. I was walking across a very popular bar. I was walking, and I saw a pastor friend of mine. I'm like, hey, how you doing? Everything okay? Great. And I saw him going into the bar. And me, I'm like, me and my spiritual infant ignorance, I'm like, oh, you're going to go and testify? Where's your stuff? Let me go see if I can. He says, oh, no, I'm going to a party. I said, what? I said, but you're going into a bar. He says, yes, I'm anointed. I said, oh, Jesus. Oh, yes. I can see me now. Come on, Pastor, I'm having a rough day. Meet me at Wooders. I'll get those Russell eyes in a minute. It's just not flying. And then before I came back to Shekinah, my husband and I went to a nightclub, and I was there, and I saw this guy, and so I was like, what's wrong? I said, that's an assistant pastor. And he was sitting there. I don't know if he was putting his hands in the air like he didn't care or whatever. I don't know. But I wasn't even in church, and it bothered my spirit. It really bothered me. I even had to leave. I was so upset. And then I hear about churches who have pastors who are so puffed up with the Pharisee spirit that they can't even see the Holy Spirit coming into their church to make changes because all they see is themselves. How could you have homosexuals in a choir or a praise team or anywhere else, people who are high one day, coming in, doing whatever, and then you wonder how come your church isn't going anywhere? Or your church is going somewhere, it's going backward. How can we have people who are called ministers of music or ministers of everything? Let's put it this way. How can we have it if they are in charge of children, but they don't even go home and take care of their own? How could we do that? How could we go to a meeting about same-sex marriage and have a pastor talk about, I would marry homosexuals, it's all about love? All that caressing with the spiritual adultery, and guess what? Satan is going to expose it right in God's face and say to God, and you thought you were a church of who? And you thought they were children of what? They're a church of fraud. I can't get them all, but I'll get this group. And this is what I was told. Bermuda is in a state of spiritual adultery. And it really, really just topped it off, and it made it really easy because you could look around and see what's going on. We have a harvest of souls that are ready, that we have to go and get. Time is getting short. The days are getting darker. But we can't be thinking that we're going to be church one day and then go out and do what we want the next. And Satan, that feels good, doesn't it? How could we be like that, church? We need to understand that we have to stand up to these standards. We have to be the standard. We cannot go ahead and drop it because it doesn't feel good. God didn't say if it feels good, keep it. He just said keep it. I mean, come on. It's incredible. Do we have redemptive hearts as this woman? Or do we have the mentality of the scribes and Pharisees in our hearts to test Jesus? Well, I'm going to tell you, if we do, we are asking for death because we're going back to a law. We need to stay in grace. We need to stay in prayer. We need to stay in the blood. We can't go around doing one thing or the other because let me tell you what that woman did. She stood there and she took her grace. She never said it wasn't me. She said it, she took it. Nobody's accused me. He says, I don't condemn you either. Come on, church. His resurrection has raised us up out of sin. Let's go and get the harvest in love. Time is running out. Romans 13, 18, 14 says, owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling of the law. So let's put it like this. The scribes and the Pharisees couldn't touch Jesus because Jesus loved this woman. Not in the physical sense, but in the gracious sense. When they couldn't kill her with the law because he went ahead and put the question back on them, they had nothing to say, and all they could do was flee. And she stood there and took it. Let's be like that, church. Let's not flee when anything comes to us as untoward. We need to stand up, and we need to be sure-footed in the word. Because if we don't know our word, they could just come and push us down and do whatever they want and invite their friends to come and do the same. So let's be like this woman. Let's be like her in grace. Blessings abound.